This is a production of Cornell University.
Today I'm going to be talking about tea and the taste of climate change. I've been studying the tea system since 2006. For me, tea is a really interesting way to examine human interactions with the environment because it is a plant system that humans have managed for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And I'm specifically focusing on the impacts of climate change on tea. As we know, climate change is impacting agro-ecosystems and farmer livelihoods, as well as the health benefits consumers get from agricultural products around the world. For example, a longer frost-free growing season can help increase the production of specific crops. And as previous scholars have shown, this really depends where you are located geographically in the world, and it also depends on the specific crop that you're speaking about. Whether it's rice or soy, each plant behaves differently. And most previous scholars have documented or focused on looking at the impact of climate change on crop yield. This is relatively well documented. And what my study focuses on with my collaborators is looking at the impact of climate change on crop quality, which is a lot less acknowledged. And the way I am looking at this is through a coupled natural and human systems approach, where we have our natural system of biotic and abiotic factors, and then we have our human system of traders and consumers and farmers. And sort of the link between that is the agro-ecosystem or our food production system. And the feedback loop between the natural system and the human system that I'm focusing on, in addition to yield, is really crop quality. And then the way that the human system sort of takes that response and then feeds into the natural system is through their actual adaptation and management of agro-ecosystems. And then obviously these agro-ecosystems do not exist on their own. They're impacted by exogenous change, such as climate change, policies, as well as markets. And so that's sort of the overall socio-ecological system, which I'm looking at, and really a focus on crop quality. And crop quality is important, as I mentioned before, because it's not only yields that are important for food security, or for the amount of money farmers receive from selling crops, it's also the actual quality of those products. So if you're thinking about all of these sort of diverse fruits and vegetables, it's not only calories, but it's also the micronutrients. And these micronutrients vary based on management of the agro-ecosystem. For example, a carrot grown in an organic system versus a carrot grown in a conventional system may have varying levels of the secondary metabolites that provide the main health benefits from consuming these carrots. And so if you're consuming a carrot that has relatively low concentrations of these secondary metabolites, you're also not going to be getting the same health benefits and have to consume more of the same product. And so I've sort of taken that framework and applied it to looking at the tea system to see the impacts on tea in my study, but really thinking about botanical quality more broadly of both food and medicinal plants, which are central to ethnobotanical systems. So the overall objective of my study is to provide quantitative data how and why tea quality is vulnerable to changing climate conditions, and that's at the natural level of the system, and then the resulting linkages to the social system, both economic as well as cultural. So I'm just going to go through the main objectives of this study. And today I'm going to share how climate is impacting tea quality and yield. I'm going to share some data from field sampling, as well as manipulative greenhouse experiments. So I've been using extreme climate events in the field as a proxy measure for climate events that are supposed to become more prevalent with climate change. And of course, there's a lot of confounding factors that occur with field sampling, and so I'm also coupling that with manipulative greenhouse experiments that mimic climate predicted or expected climate factors. And then I'm bringing those samples back to the lab to look at the phytochemical variation. The second objective is then to take those same tea samples and see the way the consumers are responding to that variation in secondary metabolite chemistry through sensory analysis. And my collaborative team, we're also doing agricultural economics modeling to look at how climate variables are impacting yields on a larger scale. And the third objective is looking at the way farmers are responding to variations of climate variability in their tea systems, both based on their direct observation as well as the way they are responding to markets. So if consumers are perceiving sensory variation in tea, how does that impact consumer buying decisions? And then how does that impact the way farmers are managing their agroecosystems? And what decisions are they making based on consumer responses? And then finally, the goal is to take all of this varied socio-ecological data and to construct a model where we'll be able to simulate the response of tea quality to variable climate factors. And the goal of this is to develop plans and policies that we can provide to tea farmers and land use managers to better adapt and mitigate for climate change. So when I'm talking about tea, I'm specifically talking about Camellia sinensis and the Theaceae family. That is the commercial source for all white, green, oolong, black, and pu'er tea. So it comes from this one single species, and it's the variation in the processing that results in this diversity of flavor profiles that we get, but it is from the same species. And Camellia sinensis has two main cultivars, or two main varieties, excuse me. The sinensis variety, which is a small leaf or variety that grows in more temperate areas, and the Assamica variety, which is the broadleaf variety, which is considered the original variety that grows in tropical and subtropical areas. And in addition to those varieties, there's also a lot of diversity with lots of farmer land races and cultivars. The reason, particularly in Yunnan province, in southwestern China, which is considered the birthplace of the tea plant. So Yunnan borders Myanmar, Vietnam, and Laos. And in this area, you see not just Camellia sinensis growing in the wild, but also 11 other species that are closely related to Camellia sinensis that farmers use the germplasm in their tea systems for integration, resulting in a lot of genetic diversity and having this area be sort of the center of genetic diversity for the tea plant. These are a few pharma land races. So with my background, I would say these are all Camellia sinensis variety Assamica, and DNA barcoding would confirm that. However, the farmers that I work with in Yunnan have a different name for each of these different land races, and they also have different sensory attributes or uses for these. Even though I'm saying they're all Camellia sinensis variety Assamica, there's a lot deeper ecological knowledge and use by the farmers that are managing these systems. And they may have 15 to 20 different land races of tea within a single tea garden of just a hectare. So a lot of diversity, and if you sort of compare that to our main food crops in the world, it's really fascinating to see why and how farmers manage this diversity. So tea plants can, tea leaves can grow to different sizes. Imagine one of these tea leaves unfurling in your teacup. And that probably wouldn't happen so much over here because usually when tea is commercialized, it's the new bud and the adjacent two leaves are the harvest units for commercialization. However, in indigenous communities that have been managing tea for hundreds of years, farmers do harvest the older leaves, which they use to make tonics for immune boosting, and this is an example of that harvest. So tea in its native state grows to be a tall tree, about 15 to 20 meters tall, and it grows in these beautiful biodiverse forests in southern Yunnan, into northeastern India, in Burma, and in Laos. And then with human management, that sort of traditional forest system has transitioned. So this over here is a tea agroforest. It still looks a lot like a forest system. However, it's been intensified for tea production, and some of the woody plant species have been removed from the system. However, a lot of food and medicinal plants are still maintained. I had done an inventory of about 20 meter by 20 meter plots, and I found over 200 food and medicinal plants that were conserved within the space by the community for various needs. This over here is a mixed crop system, and it has tea and it's intercropped with grains. However, tea in most parts of the world grows in monocultural terrace plantations, really for consistent product and high yield. And so there's a lot of different management, and obviously based on the different management, the phytochemical qualities of tea also vary. And just another note on the management of these systems, an agroforest, because it's relying on a forest structure, doesn't need to have agrochemical inputs like pesticides and fertilizers, because it's relying on ecosystem services provided by the forest structure, whereas monocultural plantations, even if they're organic, generally have agrochemical input of pesticides and herbicides, etc. And as I mentioned, we're not necessarily consuming tea in large quantities for yield. It really depends on the quality. And so if you're a black tea drinker versus a green tea drinker, that variation is because of the change in chemistry that occurred during processing. You might buy high mountain teas versus low mountain teas because you really have a preference for specific phytochemistry. So the main phytochemicals for tea that give its health benefits are the polyphenols, with EGCG being sort of the star antioxidant compound, which has gotten a lot of press and advertisement. And all of those different phytochemicals, including the polyphenols and methylxanthine caffeine, which gives tea its stimulant properties, theanine, which makes tea sort of a relaxant. All of these have a specific taste which consumers are able to perceive, such as bitter, sweet, or bitter and sweet. And this really varies, again, as I mentioned, with environmental management. And just a little note over here on the bottom, this shows sort of the evolution of tea. The historic use of tea is considered to have been medicine, and sort of transitioned from medicine to a tonic and eventually to a beverage. Tea leaves are consumed as a food in some parts of the world, sort of like a salad. And tea, I find it a really compelling study system because it is the most consumed beverage in the world after water, so it has really quite widespread utilization. There's hundreds of years of management, and it also plays an important role in public health because it provides a notable source of antioxidant phytochemicals. And these are linked to different benefits in the human body, such as anti-inflammatory, prevention against cancer, as well as for cardiovascular health. So tea was traditionally sort of the center of diversity, as I mentioned, was in southern Yunnan, which is over here. And because of these health benefits provided by tea, it became requested or demanded in communities that couldn't grow it. So over here, this red line basically is the Tea Horse Road, which is the book that Dr. Rodriguez had showed. And this is the oldest tea trade route in the world. And over here, this is the Tibetan Plateau. This is Lhasa over here. And communities in the Tibetan Plateau live in pretty harsh conditions where it's really hard to grow fruits and vegetables, and they came to utilize tea as a substitute for fruits and vegetables. And that really is what spurred the creation of this old historic road, which not only was tea traded, but lots of other spices and medicines. And that was sort of the first spread of tea And then as more and more communities began to know of tea, and it was really through Buddhist monks that spread the consumption of tea, more and more people began to incorporate into their daily routine. So I'm just going to share some photographs from the Tea Horse Road to give you a better cultural context of this area. This is an Aka village. It's a tea farming community in southern Yunnan, where I've been working since 2006. And just some pictures of the Tea Horse Road itself. So the last picture is tea being consumed by Tibetan households, and it's been churned with butter, yak butter specifically. So this is yak butter tea. Has anybody tried yak butter tea? Yes. What's the flavor profile for you? Yeah. Acquired taste. And so I was mentioning earlier how the quality of tea varies based on environmental conditions, and this is just one example. If tea is harvested from a low elevation versus sort of at the top of the mountain, data suggests that there is phytochemical variation, and this is why a lot of consumers seek out high mountain teas, and it's also the prices of those are notably higher. Again, we're looking at a tea agroforest versus a monoculture. And some of the work that I had done for my doctoral dissertation was to sort of analyze the difference, the phytochemical variation. So this is an agroforest in an Aka community, and this is a monoculture plantation nearby at the same elevation, and we found that there was more than twice the amount of key catechin compounds for tea procured from the agroforest. And this may be because of many reasons. It may be because there's a lot more pest pressures in an agroforest, or because of shade trees, or because of the height of trees. So a lot of different factors, which we're now looking at the specific mechanism through greenhouse studies. Oh, catechins are polyphenolic compounds that provide antioxidant activity in humans. So it's sort of the link to the health benefits of green tea. And so this is just the variation based on the production system, and then based on geographic region or the specific cultivar, the phytochemicals also vary in tea. So in blue here we have all the different sort of tea producing areas within China. And then, as I mentioned before, when you process tea from white tea to black tea or post-fermented pu'er tea, there's also a change in phytochemicals based on all the different processing factors. So the main processing that happens once tea is harvested is steaming it or pan frying it, and this is to deactivate the polyphenolic oxidase that oxidizes the catechin compounds, rolling it to break down the cell walls and remove moisture content, and then drying it. And this really helps preserve the health compounds attributed to the different teas. And then variation in these different processes results in all of these different types of tea. And my previous work has shown, as well as that by a lot of other scientists, that consumers can perceive changes in tea secondary metabolites. And so this is a ranking of tea, 100 different teas. And the less intensely rated teas also had lower amounts of catechins, as well as the methylxanthine caffeine. And now I'm going to talk about the cup of tea that specifically drove my research on the impacts of climate change in tea. This is during one of my first field seasons in 2007, and I was in a Aka household drinking tea after a long day of ecological sampling. And then I returned to that same house about 3 days later, and the East Asian monsoon had hit. And we were drinking tea again, and the head of the household, female, says it has changed, the taste has changed. And I was really curious what she meant. And then her husband also drank the tea, and he also confirmed that the tea had changed. What they were referring to was that the East Asian monsoon had hit. And so they had sort of transitioned from a spring harvest to a monsoon harvest, which is really attributed to when the rains come. And then quality drops notably, and the prices farmers get for their tea also drops. And then when the autumn harvest is basically determined by the retrieval of the East Asian monsoon, and at this stage the quality is perceived to increase as well as the prices that farmers get for their tea. So it really is an issue not just of the phytochemicals that we're consuming, but also the livelihoods that farmers are getting from their crop. And after her husband tested the tea, he determined the price to be about half of that of the spring harvest. And this is just some data showing how there's a drop in prices based on the different seasons. And that really made me start thinking about the role that precipitation has in tea quality, and what does this mean with increased or decreased precipitation that's occurring with climate change. And so the central tenet of my study is sort of looking at tea as an indicator species for climate change and what this can tell us about other plants that we're using specifically for the leaf. And then thinking about taste as a sensor of climate change and its effects on food quality. So really thinking about the individual consumer and then the role that they're playing in sensing climate change based on taste. And now I'm going to share some data from the natural side component of this study. And so for the field sampling, I am working with my collaborators, and we're sampling at 3 different sites in China, or 3 different regions in China, which are different sort of kind of capture the different climatic conditions of major tea producing areas in China. At each site we have, or location, we have 2 sites, a high elevation and a low elevation site. We try to choose the elevations to be somewhat the same, and also the cultivar that's in each of the systems is also we've accounted for. And we're sampling basically from 2012 till 2016, so it's a 5-year study, and multiple seasons within the year. And the goal eventually is then to take all of the data on tea quality and yields from these 5 years and these 6 different locations, and combine them to eventually construct our model. So I'm going to share data from one of our sampling years, and this is our very first sampling year. And so this was taken in just one location, where we sample basically across 15 days during an extreme drought period, as well as the onset of the monsoon, and then during an extreme monsoon period. And over here we're looking at the response of leaf biomass from during the drought to the monsoon. So we see an increase in both leaf length as well as weight. And then concurrently there is a significant reduction in secondary metabolite concentrations from the spring drought to the monsoon. So the major antioxidant compounds that determine tea quality were shown to decrease. And that work I did in the lab using HPLC, as well as some basic bioassays and antioxidant assays. I'm not a chemist, and so that's why I find collaboration really to be the spice of life and very promising and fulfilling in my research. And so I'm collaborating with some chemists who are experts at GCMS. And so they also are looking at the same samples, where they've developed this really comprehensive tea library, and they're looking at the specific volatiles or aroma compounds that determine tea quality. And they also found that there were a few more aroma compounds in the spring samples or the drought samples compared to the monsoon samples. And so we found an inverse relationship overall in terms of our leaf weight to secondary metabolite concentrations. This suggests either a dilution effect and or water stress to the plant. And what does this sort of mean? That was just a seasonal study, so what does this sort of mean for larger climate change? Looking at precipitation in the field site shows that there really has been historically, this looks at data from 1980 to 2010, there really historically has been this variation of precipitation throughout the year, and overall there seems to be a downward trend in precipitation at the study site. Which suggests that tea quality could actually be getting better with climate change. However, plants do have their thresholds, as we know, and so if precipitation becomes too low, this may just be detrimental to the plant overall. And then looking at, that was sort of annual precipitation, and now looking at seasonal precipitation. Overall, spring precipitation has increased since 1970, about 15 to 20% of the study site. And then at the same time, monsoon precipitation has also increased. And the decrease in precipitation was during the autumn season. And that's when farmers are not harvesting as much tea. And then looking into the future, future climate scenarios for the 2050 to 2079 period shows that precipitation is expected to decrease during the spring season. So again, perhaps this may impact tea quality positively if it doesn't cross the plant threshold. And then during the monsoon season, it's supposed to be getting wetter. And so basically, farmers are going to be seeing variable impacts on their tea systems. And that was only just for 1 year sampling at one study site. And our goal is to take that sort of coupled climate and tea quality data for 5 years at these 6 locations towards really having a better understanding and making a stronger statement of climate effects on tea quality. And I had also only shown data from one site, and this is looking at tea production across China, and this is looking at temperature. So there's been an upward trend of temperatures in all tea producing sites in China. There's also been, while temperatures are increasing, precipitation overall in tea producing sites in China is decreasing. And then overall, yields have been increasing, and this is taking into consideration any changes in technology for tea production. In the field, we've only sort of looked at precipitation and temperature. However, there's multiple dynamics that are happening, of course, in agroecosystems, and farmers are reporting, for example, changes in pest pressures, different weeds, and then changes in pollination dynamics within their systems. So in the future, we plan to look at these a little bit more carefully. And we're going to be doing that also in manipulative greenhouse experiments. And I find these experiments really wonderful to engage undergraduate students, because we don't have to take students all the way to China, which is also a great thing to do, but we can also have a little tea plantation right there in the greenhouse. And one of the undergraduate research projects looking at different variables actually found that the interaction of herbivory with precipitation offset the increased precipitation. And so when we're just looking at a single climate variable, we may have one conclusion, but when we actually look at the interactions that are happening within agroecosystems, one effect may offset another effect. And interestingly, some farmers are accounting for pest as a promising strategy for when their tea quality decreases. So there's a specific tea that grows in Taiwan, and with the increased precipitation that's happening during the monsoon season, the quality is considered so low. However, pest pressures are also increasing in that area, and instead of putting pesticides as farmers usually do, they're now actually letting the pests proliferate in their tea agroecosystems because it sort of results in a different change in secondary metabolite chemistry and actually giving that tea a slightly peachy or honey-like flavor. And so these are all these different sort of adaptation strategies that farmers are taking in response to climate change or climate variation. And now I'm going to share some data from the human system. So one of the major components of the sensory analyses, and I don't have the data to share right now, but I wanted to just show the different types of sensory analysis that we're doing. So we're actually going to be speaking to 5 different populations since there's a lot of human variation and cultural variation on the way we respond or perceive taste and our preferences. So one population are tea farmers, traders, and connoisseurs in China. Another one is an expert tea panel at the Tea Research Institute of China that's been trained to really measure tea quality. And then we are coupling this with tea populations in the United States. One is a tea panel at Tufts University, and then Western tea consumers and Western tea experts. So really getting a diverse group of consumers to see maybe only tea farmers and tea experts are able to perceive this difference. Maybe Western consumers aren't, or maybe they are. So these are sort of the experiments that we're doing right now to see how notable or who's actually able to discern these changes in phytochemical quality. And another major component of the research is really looking at the way farmers are perceiving climate impacts on their tea systems. So I'm going to share a little bit of information from 3 sites in the Bulong Mountains of southwestern China, where I conducted semi-structured surveys with 3 different indigenous groups, the Bulong, the Lahu, and the Aka. And then I took that survey data and carried out cultural consensus analysis to look at variation within a community and between communities. And these are some overall patterns that we have seen. Farmers are reporting that there is increased rainfall, unpredictability, as well as increased temperatures. And farmers are also saying that they really perceive that rain impacts tea quality. However, they're not really sure how temperatures increase or impact tea quality. And that's some information that perhaps our tea project will be able to show. And within these 3 different indigenous groups that all are in the Bulong Mountains, we did find high degree of informant agreement on the effects of climate change. More recently, I've started to interview tea farmers and that don't own the land, or these 3 indigenous communities have been managing tea agroecosystems, or their communities have, for hundreds of years. So they really have this ecological knowledge that has been passed down. And more recently in eastern China, I've been interviewing tea farmers that are more landless laborers that have only been, some of them only recently introduced to this tea system, and they have a very different understanding of the way climate is impacting their tea systems. So it's not that all farmers are aware of this. I'm really seeing that it's, the indigenous farmers have a very different understanding compared to farmers that have not necessarily managed an agroecosystem for that long. And the farmers, that are aware of it are also very concerned on the impact that it has on tea prices. So we're seeing this inverse relationship of precipitation and tea price historically. And so how are farmers responding to these different changes? Over here I've sort of summarized from the coding of the data some of the different farmer responses to climate change. So some farmers have started to substitute different varieties and make their tea gardens more diverse. Others are actually planting other crops just so they aren't putting all their eggs in one basket. There is some modification of the environment with technology and management. For example, in places where they have really intense droughts, farmers are starting to think about having irrigation systems. I had mentioned the example of letting pests proliferate in the field. There's also alteration of post-harvest processing And so during processing, you can really also change the chemistry. So some teas that were historically processed as green teas are now being processed as oolongs or blacks, where they're really taking advantage of processing to enrich in the flavor. There's also some repurposing of the end use of the product. And overall, in certain communities, people are very active in sort of thinking about how to market their products differently. And then in some communities, people are abandoning their tea systems or they're relocating the locations, maybe to higher elevations in the mountain, which they perceive as having or being more resilient to climate effects. And so I previously had talked about these two different systems, the agroforest and a tea monoculture, and a lot of the farmers who do manage both systems, this monoculture system has really been promoted throughout China through government extension. The Grain for Green program or policy actually gave farmers incentives to have this sort of system. And so in some communities, you see farmers managing both an agroforest as well as a monocultural plantation. And the farmers that manage both will say how their agroforests are more resilient to different climate variation that happens from year to year or from season to season. And so looking at the drop in tea quality, there was a slightly smaller drop, or notably smaller drop in tea quality for agroforest compared to the monoculture, and this is only sampling over 1 year. So we're going to be continuing this to see if this trend upholds in more sites. And agroforests also, provide a lot more economic benefits to farmers. So the blue line over here is looking at the market price at this field site for tea from an agroforest, and the orange is looking at during the same season price for terrace or monocultural plantation tea. So farmers really do have an economic incentive, not just an ecological incentive to grow tea in agroforests. And then some of my previous work also showed that agroforests have a little bit more genetic diversity, or notably more genetic diversity than terrace plantations. And so taking all of this information that I presented today, just having you think as an audience of the role of taste as a sensor of climate change. And I'm not sure if you personally or have had relatives or friends say that, oh, this fruit or vegetable used to taste really different before when I was younger, and some of that might have to do perhaps with the way it's cultivated, or some of that might actually have to do with climate variables. So just something to think about. And then specifically, I'm thinking about tea as an indicator species of climate change, but what other crops can we look at to be an indicator species for climate change? And then the role of adaptive capacity in determining the extent of climate effects. And so there's one body of work that really focuses on mitigating climate change, and the other work that really focuses on adapting to climate change. So what would it mean for sustainability if monoculture plantations transitioned to systems like this? And overall, I've been starting to use this coupled model to look at other systems as well, not just tea quality. So I leave you with a few questions. Is climate change changing the taste and quality of our favorite and or local foods? And what does this mean for farmer livelihoods? And what does it mean for the health benefits that we derive from these specialty crops and for food security? And more recently, as I've been expanding my research using the socio-ecological model, I've started to look at the impacts of climate change on maple syrup quality. And I know there's some really great research happening here at Cornell looking at the impacts of climate change on maple syrup. And recently, my collaborators and I got a USGS grant to look at this, which is specifically focusing on the impacts on quality versus yields. And then in Montana, where I teach, I'm also starting to look at 2 new systems, which are huckleberries and flathead cherries, which are 2 agricultural products that the state really prizes for its cultural identity. And so I just wanted to thank you as an audience for being here today, and thank you so much, Dr. Rodriguez, for hosting me, and to Tara for all the coordination of this event. And also wanted to acknowledge my collaborators. It's a very interdisciplinary, collaborative project, and that's very much determines the nature of my work. Students and undergraduate students are huge parts of the research, as are the farming communities that I work with. And then, of course, the National Science Foundation for making the work possible. Thank you.
A change in the taste of tea over
Yes.
the past like 15 years in green tea, and not for the better. And I'm curious, well, maybe it's climate change, but I'm curious, does it come from different places, what's visible to us here now,
Yeah,
than it used to come from? And does
Yeah.
it come from less tasty places?
So more and more for the United States, tea has started to come from South America, like Argentina, as well as in Africa. So a lot more tea is being sort of being directed from Asia to new tea producing areas. So that could be one reason. It's just like the change in geographic location could be one factor. And I guess also from where companies are sourcing the quality of the tea they're sourcing. Yes.
I read a study somewhere where the rates of cancer of the esophagus was very high in China, and it was partly related to the teeth that they were drinking. And if I'm correct, the way they prepare it is they use extremely hot water. Is that right?
So it really depends on the specific type of tea, but a lot of times when people are on the go, they'll just grab really hot water and put tea leaves into like a thermos. And if people are sort of drinking tea at home, it's usually not like that. So there is a lot of the population that's sort of drinks tea where the water is really hot.
Yeah, because basically the conclusions were there was because they drank the tea so hot, plus of course the catechins themselves, which can be quite damaging. So I'm just wondering whether you did see any kind of high rates of cancer among these tea drinkers. For example, the ones
I guess I would say
with
I've
the
seen
milk.
the inverse in the communities that I work with. They really don't have a prevalence of cancer.
Of the esophagus.
Yeah, and it's not really something that's come up in my research. I'm not actually very familiar with that specific study, but overall, I would say the meta-analysis and reviews that have been done on the health benefits of tea usually have shown that it's been beneficial for various health outcomes. Obviously, it depends on the type of cancer. So I'm not actually familiar with that study.
Yeah, because I wanted the yak, or whatever you call it, milk is actually very beneficial in the fact that that's why the Brits, when they added milk, they had less rates of cancer of the esophagus, and it was apparently related to the fact that it was precipitating some of the catechins, and they were not as toxic. So I'm just wondering whether.
Yeah, so that's interesting because most of the catechins are linked to the health benefits of tea. So I would have to look at that study. Yes.
While your data shows that there are changes in precipitation patterns during the monsoon season, monsoons have always happened. So I would assume that the quality and therefore the price of tea harvested during or after the monsoon has traditionally dropped for farmers.
Yeah, so I think there's always been sort of a variation, and it sort of now seems that the variation is becoming larger with more variation in climate events. So it is something that's always happened, but it seems like it's becoming a little bit more variable.
You showed a huge variation in price between the plantation tea and the agroforestry tea. It was almost tenfold. What is driving this very high price for the agroforestry tea? And do you see this difference when you do your GC mass spec on?
Absolutely. So about more than 99% of the tea produced in the world is in terrace plantation, so it's less than 1%. So one is just supply. It's very low supply. There's very little agroforest tea. It's a system that's really been replaced in the last 50 years. And so the supply is really low, and you can't just create an agroforest overnight. So even though monoculture plantations or terrace farmers might see, oh, that's really attractive, you can't suddenly have all these trees in your system.
So what are the purchasers valuing in that? What are the purchasers valuing? What makes a person pay 10 times
more? Right.
I know it's scarcity, but
okay.
Most people won't do that just because it's scarce. There's something they must be appreciating.
Right. So I had just briefly showed sort of the difference in the phytochemicals. So these are just the catechins that are attributed to the flavor compounds. And so the flavor is a lot more intense from an agroforest. And you can I can definitely perceive it. One of the indicators of really high quality tea, if you don't have a GCGC or HPLC in your kitchen, is the taste lingers a lot more when you have a tea from an agroforest. It's called gan. And a really high quality tea might have that sort of honey-like taste back in your throat for more than an hour. And so you can sort of, it resonates for a while. And so that was one. And then the second one is around 2002, 2003. And as you can see, the price of agroforest tea also hasn't always been the same. It's really increased since 2002 over here. So prices have really been increasing. And in that period between 2002 and 2003, there were a lot of reports in Taiwan and Hong Kong of negative health effects from drinking tea, physiological responses, and they were attributed to pesticides and herbicides in tea plantations. So it was really during that period that people began to sort out organic tea, and the agroforests have absolutely no chemical input. And so it was really, it tastes a lot better, and then people felt safer. And in teas you could, there's high pesticides, it makes your throat sort of feel dry instead of wet and high quality.
What is the TCC value for white tea versus, let's say, oolong or the other?
The value? So I had done a study looking at, there's a lot of variation on tea. So like not all white teas are the same, not all green teas are the same, not all oolongs are the same. Within, let's say, just one type of white tea like silver needle, depending on the manufacturer and how long it's been stored, there's significant variation. So a lot of the main catechins and antioxidant compounds in tea degrade after 6 months. So those of you who have a closet of tea that you've been storing, remember fresh is best, unless it's poor tea, which actually is supposed to get better with age.
What's the best way to store it?
Right, so it's sort of the traditional things for preserving phytochemicals, which is sort of a cool temperature, removing as much of the air, so kind of a nice sealed container. If you have a bag, I usually sort of like remove as much of the air in the bag as possible. If it's in a really big container, it's only a little bit of tea, put it in a smaller sort of airtight container, and then keep it out of the dark, or keep it out of the light.
Well, thank you very much.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.